Today's debut episode of Tin House Live is brought to you by the Tin House Winter Writers' Workshops. The 4 winter workshops, one each in short fiction, poetry, nonfiction, and the novel, are now accepting applications for winter 2020. These intimate workshops combine the rugged beauty of the Pacific Coast with a weekend focused on craft and community. Participants stay in the Sylvia Beach Hotel in Newport, Oregon, which offers 21 different literary-themed rooms. This year's faculty includes writing luminaries from Ted Chiang and T. Kira Madden to Lydia Kiesling and Esme Wei-Jung Wong, among many others. Scholarships are available, including one for single parents. The application deadline is October 16th, and you can find more information at tinhouse.com. Today is the first episode of a new venture we are calling Tin House Live. Tin House asked if I'd be willing to curate and present audio from the many years of their summer writing workshops. So probably once a month, in addition to the 2 episodes of conversations you are already familiar with, I'll also be presenting material from the archives, craft lectures given by writers, readings given in the outdoor amphitheater, and panels on certain topics about writing. For those who are Patreon supporters, this additional material will not increase the amount you are pledging per month. In other words, if you're pledging, say, $2 an episode, which is usually $4 a month, the Tin House Live episodes won't count as an additional episode for Patreon supporters. Today's Tin House Live episode is a panel that I moderated at last summer's writers' workshop called Vision and Revision: Finding the Life of the Story, with 4 writer panelists, Jamel Brinkley, Danielle Evans, Karen Shepard, and R.O. Kwon. They all have distinctive voices that are easy to tell apart, but they don't say their names before they speak. So to help you connect who is who, the order in which they speak for the first time is Jamel, Danielle, Karen, and then Reese. Without further ado, here is the panel on vision, revision, and finding the life of the story.
Really lucky a year ago to incorporate into the Tin House family to what my mind is one of the best, not even literary podcasts, but just podcasts around, and that's David Naimon's Between the Covers. If you haven't checked it out yet, it's basically a craft lecture each conversation. And we're really lucky to have David Naimon here today and part of the Tin House family. And if you notice any tension on the stage, particularly between Jamel and David, they were battled last year. We have a fantasy basketball league, and they were in the championship, and Jamel destroyed David. So if there seems to be any really pointed questions just in one direction, that's probably why. But please welcome David Naimon.
Thanks, Lance. Since we're talking about visioning and revisioning and drafting and revision, I kind of wanted to start with finding out whether our panelists saw those as 2 different activities, because often you hear about, I think most often you hear about people wearing 2 different hats and conjuring 2 different skill sets when they're drafting and when they're revising. But then occasionally you hear of writers like Amy Hempel who doesn't revise very much, or the way she revises, explains her revision as it in a way happens before the drafting. She will revise a sentence in her head before she writes the sentence. And so there's very little revision that happens after the drafting. So I want to start with my nemesis, Jamel. Because,
Bring it on.
because you've talked about how you subscribe to a version of the writing process of D'Ambrosio, one that requires that the writer distinguish between what he calls the initiating subject versus the real subject, or the triggering subject and the generated subject. So I was hoping maybe you could walk us through what that looks like and why that's a model that you feel like you like to adopt for your own writing.
Yeah. Is this okay? Can you hear me? I think so. So that idea actually comes from Richard Hugo in his book, The Triggering Town. And what I like about it is that it sort of encourages you to write sort of a messy first draft, a first draft that can court your sort of unconscious or subconscious thinking, and that things appear on the page that maybe don't make sense at first glance, or maybe go against whatever your initiating impulse was. But that often, when you look at that kind of messy first draft, there are things in there that show you what the story really wants to be about. I think ideally that messy first draft would be a quick first draft. Unfortunately, I write slow, messy first drafts. And I think, you brought the Amy Hempel thing, and I think, what's happening with me is that because I'm sort of writing with a very small sense of what the story is about, I don't have much to guide me. I am sort of revising sentence by sentence as I go just to achieve a stability of sound. Which is the only thing I kind of rely on. But as far as like what comes out in those sentences, that's the messy part. So I need to get a certain sound that's pleasing to me to get through the first draft, but it's still messy.
When I studied with D'Ambrosio also, and one of the ways he put it was that once there is a draft, there's a desire in the draft itself that's maybe different than the desire that the writer had when they created the draft. And so it's this switching to listening to the desire of the draft rather than the triggering event. Is that another way to put it?
Exactly. So, the idea is that sometimes if you start with a certain intentionality and you get a first draft out and that draft veers away from your intentionality, you have a choice. Are you going to try to sort of stubbornly cling to the thing you thought you were writing about, or are you going to see possibility in what's on the page and maybe submit a little to that, which is what I tend to do when I'm revising my work.
So if we take that model, I would be curious what our other distinguished panelists, whether they see themselves in that, or the ways in which they don't see themselves in that and diverge from that way of writing.
I have to know what a story is before I can revise it, and the only way that I know what a story is to kind of write it and see the shape. And that means sometimes revision is a wildly different process depending on where the story is at the end of the first draft. I tend to ask really every story that I'm sort of thinking about, whether it's in workshop or my own work, when I get to the end of it, what its operating questions are, kind of what the question it promised to resolve is, and what the question that it leaves, question or questions that it's supposed to leave open are. And I think a draft is done when I can answer those questions, but sometimes I've only answered those questions by getting to the end of writing the wrong story, and then I have to basically start over. And other times the sort of draft feels structurally sound, and I get to sort of just clean it up and work on the sentences, and most of the time it's somewhere in between.
Yes, all those things, yes. I would also say that after doing it for a while, I know what my tricks and tendencies and ways of hiding from myself are. So probably in the revision process, I have a little bit of an antenna out for those tricks and protections. So I, for example, am someone who is always in their writing and in their life trying to balance control with messiness. I'm sort of a type A personality who likes to be in control, and that's not always a great thing as a drafter of fiction. It's better when you're revising, I think. But so I'm always looking for ways in which I'm trying to hang on too tightly to something and be too Maria Kondo about things, and let things go. I'm also in the revision process. I mean, I think a lot of us do this for the character, especially for the characters who are based explicitly on autobiography or on ourselves in some way, but also just for the characters you feel fondly about, which should be on some level all your characters. In my drafts, I tend to give them a free pass more than I want to in my revision. So one of the things that I'm always looking for, in particular in the process and dynamic that these guys are talking about is where did I let them exonerate themselves a little too much? Where did I not put my characters on the hook? I think, it's one of my obsessions to think about how characters are responsible for the situations in which they find themselves and how they're responsible for not getting out of those situations. So in my revision process, I'm the feet to the fire a little bit, both my characters and myself, my tendencies.
I also find myself agreeing with a lot of what everyone's saying. Maybe everything everyone's saying. I usually begin with a question or a constellation of questions, and so for my first novel, a question I began with was, what happens when people who love one another, when people who are in one another's lives hold fundamentally different beliefs about the world, and how can that play out? And then the questions breed questions, and so I just keep following the questions and seeing what happens. And so, in a way, that can be really hard because I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea who these people are. I have no idea what they want from me. And sometimes, sometimes I'll just look up while I'm writing in the middle of the night, and I'll find that I've written in all caps, like, "What do you people want from me? Why are we here? How am I failing you?" And so it's a long process of unknowing for me. And Louise Bourgeois says something, that the visual artist that I love, and someone asked her, "How do you know when a sculpture's done?" And she said, "I know it's done when the questions have stopped." And so there's that. And just in terms of drafts, early drafts, pretty much all the way until the end. Anytime I'm working on a draft, something that really helps me is to just visually understand that it's a draft. And so I write like a few words at a time, and then I press enter, and then a few words, and I press enter. And so at the end, what it looks like, anything I'm working on, if it's an essay, if it's a novel, at the end, what I have is like a really long, what looks like a sad, ragged, epic poem. And it's not an epic poem, it's prose, but it looks like a poem, so I just visually cannot see it as easily as sentences. And I'm a very sentence-driven writer, and so I'm just visually incapable of seeing it that way, and I can get over myself just a little bit while I'm drafting.
I want to do more of a deep dive into the ways we hide from ourselves in revision and self-sabotage and techniques to not do that. But before we do that, I wanted to step back and just ask a question about form and story shape and whether form plays a role either in the drafting or revision process, whether you have a conception of there being a form that you're writing in when you're doing this. I'm going to start with a tweet by Danielle. That goes. That's which one? That's maybe a segue from or in conversation with Samantha Chang's seminar. Many novels are perfect, and many short stories are perfect, and there are many more imperfect novels that should have been short stories than imperfect short stories that should have been novels. And similarly, in interviews, Danielle, you've talked about how the coming-of-age stories in your collection map well with the traditional short story form, which suggests that you perhaps have this conception of form as you're writing this particular content. And so I guess I wanted to hear more about what your view of the traditional short story form was in relationship to coming-of-age stories, and then just in general, whether that's something that you're thinking about in terms of how you're pairing what you want to write about with a specific story shape.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally for me, form kind of follows for content. So it's one of those second draft questions that I answer once I figure out where the center of the story is. I think I was talking about form in that context partly because the shape of the stories I'm working on now is really different. And so when I say the sort of classic short story model, I mean, like, at some point somebody, like, in your life probably drew that, like, what's it called? The
Red text triangle.
There you go. See, you don't need me. The sort of idea that, like, stories have a climax, right? And sometimes we're working if you were at Laura's lecture the other day, she talked about the lovely sort of subterranean of the stories, right? That often the sort of active plot is the surface level of the story, not always, but often. And sort of the emotional plot is what's happening in those underneath things, and those things interact in different ways. And I think in a sort of coming-of-age story, they often sort of follow the same arc, right? That people are making decisions, and those decisions have consequences, not ideally the expected consequences, but somebody does something and then something happens. So we have a kind of clear sense of causality, and that causality is also where the emotional resonance is, right? I did something, and now I have to understand what that meant. And I think that outside of that model, right, there's a period of life where the anxiety is about the choices that we make, and there are periods of life where the anxiety is about the choices we don't have, right? And that seems to me to need a different story model, that you can't sort of impose cause and effect or choice and consequence in the exact same way. So people can still make choices and have consequences because otherwise it doesn't feel like a story. But also there are things happening that actually matter that are not at all the things the person has control over. And so often the operative plane of the emotional story is following a really different path than the operative plane of the active story, or nothing that matters is actually happening in the active story. All of the story is kind of underneath that. So I've been thinking about different shapes. I've been thinking about the present tense and kind of what that does as somebody who works a lot with character and who, in the first person or close third, is also thinking about how characters understand themselves and the difference between that and how they're actually perceived in the world or how they're actually behaving in the world. That without that sort of secondary layer, that when somebody doesn't even have time to kind of process their own interiority or package it for you, the story looks different sometimes, just in the telling. So yeah, I've been thinking about the way that character and kind of content shape story. And I don't know that that's related or not related to the question of novels. I think that part of that is just a sort of question about people, I think, feel more pressure to turn perfectly good short stories into mediocre novels than to turn mediocre novels into perfectly good short stories.
So, Jamel, when you were on Brad Listy's Other People podcast, you said, all the best short fiction is well-shaped. But you've also said that writing longer stories allows you not to be beholden to received forms, to the 3-act structure. So I just wanted to hear more about thoughts that you have around what well-shaped means when you say that, and then again, the ways maybe you're subverting it through length.
Yeah, I think when I say well-shaped, I don't mean that stories all fall into one shape. There are a variety of shapes that stories can achieve or can aspire toward. And I agree with Danielle that I think that shape is determined by the content of the story. So I can remember instances where I'm sort of writing along that arc, and you sort of get to the climax, and there's your draft, and you're like, okay, that seems like the story. But then you look at it, and you realize that what I thought was the climax is actually a thing that should start the story. So then you sort of go back and kind of rewrite the story, basically. So what I sort of thought was the shape in the drafting actually isn't the most interesting thing. And so the process of revising or redrafting is to find the appropriate shape. When I'm talking about longer stories, I think that there are certain indulgences that I like. So one of my good friends, he's sort of he likes really sort of terse, tight, short stories, and he loves William Trevor, and I'm always like, yeah, but Alice Munro. And so we could have sort of had this friendly banter about those two writers, and I sort of think that the more novelistic rhythms and sort of the playing with time that you see in a writer like Alice Munro, those things are attractive to me. Or the ways in which, like, minor characters in an Edward P. Jones story will all of a sudden just sort of take center stage for a sentence or for a paragraph. And it's almost like you could follow them through a portal into their own short story. And I like that because they feel autonomous. But the price for that autonomy is maybe the story getting a little long or a little shaggy. But I think the suggestion of the story shape is still there. So I'm willing to forego a strict shape for characters feeling more autonomous and independent.
Can I yeah. Just something Jamel just said reminded me too of that sense that sometimes you write yourself to the thing that you're actually most interested in is linked, I think, at least in my mind, to the things that you're protecting yourself from. Mm-hmm. So it's like you're putting off getting to the thing that matters most. And I think I see it a lot in my student writers, that also that quality of I've got this one great thing that I'm going to, or, big reveal that I'm going to put right at the penultimate moment or the end of the story or whatever. And it's related to that, what Reese is saying about the questions. So it's like, if you have something really cool, right, or really dramatic or fraught that's going to happen or that's going to be thought or felt, that will give rise to other questions. It doesn't shut down the questions if it's a really good ta-da thing, right? It's going to so that moving that back up to be, okay, this is where I'm going to start, as opposed to this is where I'm going to do my flourish ending, is really useful in the drafting process. And usually it has something where I'm like, I was trying to protect myself from having to think about this thing.
Well, I'm gonna move on back to revision to talk about maybe some of the emotional challenges of revising. Antonia Nelson, in her 10 Rules of Writing, says, discovering how to be happy in the revision process is a giant breakthrough for a writer. And Mitchell S. Jackson has an amazing essay on revision at the Center for Fiction that, I don't know if he's here, but everyone should read that essay, that I feel like conjures an excitement for revision that maybe is a possible aid towards overcoming anxiety about revision. And I'm just going to read a little quote from it. Revision might include editing or proofing, but will always move beyond them. Revision is seeing the work in progress. Revision is seeing the work in context. Revision is recognizing the parts of a text and how they work to form a whole. Revision is seeing what could and should and shouldn't be there and conceiving of ways to make it so. Revision is discovering what's right and imagining how to make it more right. It's pursuing a new way of seeing and being. Revision is a philosophy. Revision is revolution. So I guess I wanted to ask this question: if discovering how to be happy in the revision process is a breakthrough for a lot of writers, if any of you have stories about that breakthrough for you, if you did find that you had trouble moving from the freedom of drafting to revision, like when Jamel, when you say you're moving the end to the beginning, I mean, was there resistance to doing that, and were there ways that any of you learned lessons that became this breakthrough, or strategies that became this breakthrough?
I hate the first drafts. The first 3, 4, 5 drafts for me tend to be really hard because there's so much unknowing, because anything could happen. I really, every other month lately, and it's not going to happen, but every other month, I'm lying, every other week, I've just been could I work with zombies? What about zombies? And I'm writing a very set in the real world novel about a photographer and a choreographer. But every now and then I'll just sit there and be like, but Reese, zombies, is this a possibility? And it's not. But I don't like that my brain just keeps asking me these questions that have nothing to do with what I'm doing. And so I love revision. And my first novel, I honestly have no idea how many revisions it went through. It's anywhere between 40 and 80 revisions. And I mean all the way through, because I tend to go all the way through usually. And I mean, at the end, some of these were very fast revisions. But still, I went through a gazillion revisions. And I'm really happy, actually, in the fine-tuning moments. And so if I've had a glorious stretch of time, and if I've had 7 hours to write that day, and if I've spent that day moving around some commas, putting in an em dash, changing it to a colon, changing one word, then at the end of the day, then I'm yeah, that was a really good day. I have done the work that I was put on this earth to do. And so I don't know that I would recommend what I do. I feel so it's maybe don't do what I do. But
I want to don't move the mic yet, because one of the most popular moments in the podcast last year was our deep dive around all of your techniques, around the way you before used to, I don't know if self-sabotage is the right word, but you had a belief system that the beginning of your novel had to be a perfect foundation, and that perfect foundation needed to be set, and then everything could be built on top of it. And so you were, for a long time, polishing the first 20 sentences over and over again, but not really progressing in the book. So I would love before we talk about some of the techniques you used, which were so amazing, around how not to do that, can you talk more conceptually about how you disabused yourself of the notion that you needed to start with a foundation that was strong to be able to progress in the story?
Yeah, so I sort of think of those first 2 years that I worked on my novel as lost years, but I also believe that it's nothing gets wasted. It's all a palimpsest. If nothing else, like that feels better, right? You're like, I throw away 100 pages, but it's not wasted. It's in there somewhere. It's fine. But so I spent the first 2 years just reworking the first 20 pages over and over again, pretty much every day for several hours a day. And I had this idea that I needed a perfect foundation, and that if the foundation were flawed, the building would be flawed, because you can't build a house on a bad foundation. I grew up in LA. I live in San Francisco, so I'm like very conscious of like foundations and earthquakes and what happens if you have a weak foundation. And so for 2 years, anytime asked me how my writing was going, I would just like start muttering about foundations. And then I threw it all away at the end of those 2 years, because what I had were 20 pages of the most overworked, inert prose that I'd ever read in my entire life. And what I realized was that the metaphor was supremely flawed, because you can't build a foundation for a building if you have no fucking idea what the building looks like. And so it's a very different foundation if you're building a one-bedroom house versus a skyscraper versus an opera house. So I let go of that, and then I started trying to write the next. After I threw everything away, I started trying to write the next, I don't know. You see, I have no idea, maybe 5 to 10 drafts as quickly as possible.
And it sounds like maybe you share something with Amy Hempel around not wanting to allow bad sentences to stay on the page as you go forward. And so you have all of these techniques that you have developed for yourself so that you can move forward with sentences that maybe aren't perfected yet. Can you share some of the for instance, turning your computer into a typewriter? Why would that be a useful thing to do?
Yeah, so I used a program. It was called Typewriter. It's gone now, but there are other. If you just Google typewriter app Mac, then you'll see options. It forced me. This app I used would only let me backspace one letter at a time, so that I couldn't go back and copy it and cut and paste and do any of it. I wrote an entire draft in which I turned every paragraph. I turned the font white as I went, so that I couldn't see what was going on in the previous paragraphs. I wrote a lot of drafts by hand. What else did I do? I didn't do this, but a friend recommended doing this. He just puts a sheet of paper over his laptop screen while he writes, so that he just cannot see what he's doing, and that way he has to force himself to go through. Something else that helps me, again, is visually just to know, just so that visually I can see that it's a draft. I put in a lot of footnotes as I write, and the footnotes tell me, so footnotes will say some things like physicality, what are the bodies doing, but then I'll let myself move on, but the footnotes tell me it's okay, it's a draft. This isn't the finished product. Sometimes the footnotes are far more. I was looking at a draft, and a footnote I'd written in all caps, just "Do better, Reese!" ! Exclamation mark! Exclamation mark! Exclamation mark! But just anything so that it doesn't look like a finished product.
So Karen, you have an essay entitled "How to Make Intermittent and Erratic Progress as a Writer" in 28 easy steps. And one of those easy steps is spending 2 years researching before you wrote your novel, The Celestials. And I imagine that could be a vortex that would be hard to escape from. How do you know when you have enough information? How does that information get employed or then ignored, even though you love the fact? And I was just curious, if you look back at those 2 years, if you could time travel and do them again with what you know now, what you've learned in that process of doing all that research in that easy step in creating that book.
So all of these techniques that we're all talking about, it seems to me that one way of looking at them is the vehicle to get to something, and the other way of looking at them is the thing that all writers are really great at, which is procrastination. And so, I mean, you can think about covering the screen as a thing that really helps you, or doing the white space, or only being able to back up, or my whole control thing. But we are ingenious at procrastinating. And so the dark side of any of these techniques is that they're a black hole that you fall into, and research is certainly one of those. For me, I think it's when I'm first starting with something, I'm not thinking about a finished product at all. I was actually thinking about this when Sam was talking about short stories versus novels and what MFA programs do to us in terms of thinking about that. I never went into an MFA program or advised my undergraduate students to go into an MFA program to come out with a finished product, whether you're working on short stories or novels. To me, that's not the value of an MFA program, and I understand market pressures are encouraging that. But I think if you think about, so when I went into the Celestials, if you think about, I'm not even thinking about what this might be finished. I had either a series of questions or a topic, or in that case, I had discovered that for a period in the 1870s, North Adams, Massachusetts, this tiny town in western Mass, had the biggest population of Asian people east of the Mississippi, short of New York. And that seemed mind-boggling to me. So I was like, here's something I want to read about. So the research to me seemed like, even if I never write about this, I read about it for 2 years, I'm not going to feel like this was a waste of my 7 hours a day or whatever. So for me, it has to be you're interested in it not as a means to an end, but an end in and of itself. And that's where I'm drawing the parallel with the MFA. Like if you're thinking about your workshop not as a means to an end, then you can workshop whatever you want, and it's valuable, and you're getting to be a better reader rather than, I mean, that's why you should go to an MFA, to be a better reader. So once you're in the nitty-gritty, when I did that, I knew nothing about 1870s America, really. I knew nothing about religion, which was a huge role, part in this book. I knew nothing about what it was like to be a Chinese working-class immigrant from southern China coming through San Francisco. I knew nothing about shoemaking, which was the factory that hired these guys. So I would come home and I would say to my husband, Jim, who's also a writer, okay, this is an amazing story. I can't do this story. Like, somebody should write this novel, but I can't write this novel. And I would writhe around on the floor, lamenting my inadequacies in all ways, and then I would organize my closet, and then I would, cook a really elaborate dinner. And then I would think, okay, but tomorrow I get to wake up and read some more about shoemaking, or read some more about these Chinese workers, or look. So I think you don't ever really know when enough is enough, and at some point you just have to say, I know enough to write this scene. That's how I would do it, right? Like, I know enough to write this exchange between this shoemaker and his wife, or I know enough to write. One of the things that Chinese workers did was they used their very meager salaries, a large portion of their very meager salaries, to take photographs of themselves. So they would go to these 2 photography studios in North Adams and sit for portraits, and that seemed like such a bizarre thing to do. And luckily, those portraits still survive. So I had them on the walls of my study, staring at me, and I thought, who does that? Like, what, it's questions, your questions. Like, what are they after by those portraits? And so I can write that scene where they're going to the photo studio, and what that American white photographer must have thought of them in their Mandarin clothing. It's not like he had that in the costume box for the photography studio. So they had one set of clothing that they traded and wore. It's also, I'm looking for those moments in all the stuff you're reading that kind of makes you tingle and go, oh my God, that's an amazing detail. Like the detail that I want to tell Jim in the evening, or that I would want to tell my friends or something. And that's, the stuff, as opposed to what you would have to pay attention to if you were a historian. You'd have to pay attention to everything, and the stuff that, makes you want to stab your eyes out with boredom, I don't have to pay attention to that, and then I can make the other stuff up. At some point in the research, though, and now I'll shut up, but at some point in the research, you're hoping not to discover new information because your fiction has taken off, you've created the whole world, and then you're like, God, I really hope I don't discover like the new historical book about the Chinese factory workers that's going to just blow up my world.
Yeah. Well, with this idea of, am I a good enough writer to do this, or can I do this, or this is too overwhelming to accomplish, I was wondering if, Jamel, you could talk about transitional drafts, because it seems like one possible way to go with a revision that seems all-encompassing in how to begin.
Yeah, so, if you have submitted something to a workshop and gotten feedback, or you have trusted readers, or you get feedback from an editor, you end up with all this stuff, right? People are just throwing comments at you, and it can be overwhelming. One way to think about it, and Margot Livesey talks about this, one way to think about it is that, the feedback is giving you sort of a heat map of your story, Maybe the exact way that people have responded to your work doesn't speak to you, but the places that people are getting tripped up on or have questions about, and you can kind of go into those areas. Another way to think about the specific feedback you get, this transitional draft method that David's referring to comes from, or at least I know it comes from Robert Boswell, and he has an essay on it that I think is available online even, and he's way more obsessive about it, which is scary because I'm a Scorpio and I'm really obsessive. But essentially, he sort of take the mountain of workshop feedback, and you kind of break it down. You look at what speaks to you, and from there he sort of makes a list of things that he thinks are relevant to the revision of the story. I don't know how this will work for novels, but and he particularly orders the list from the thing that seems most manageable to the thing that seems impossible. I'll never be able to do that. And there's a reason for that. Because if you start with the easiest thing, it gives you an entry back into the story, right? So you work on, say the dialogue in one scene, and it feels like, okay, I'm back in here. I can do this. Then you work on the next easiest thing. And one thing he mentions in his essay describing this method is that by the time you get to that thing that seemed impossible at first glance, the other work you've done on the story has actually started to shape and move towards revising that thing that seemed initially impossible. So it's actually easier now. So I think I use sort of like a bootleg version of his transitional drafts method, but I do find it useful because it's important for me, faced with not only the mess of an early draft, but the sort of mess of feedback, to focus. So I need to be able to focus on one thing at a time, and I find that really helpful. So some of you, it might be maddening to do it that way, but I like it.
I just want to say, for the sake of being contrarian, that all of this sounds maddening to me. I love you all and I love your writing, but I couldn't. And I say this because I think that process is process for you, right?
Yeah.
Nobody else's process works for your project, and the idea of isolating. I'm a really bad compartmentalizer. And I just had to learn to accept that about myself, and I can't work on a project unless I'm working on the whole project and thinking about it holistically. So covering up the page or trying to identify and list things would it would never work again. Yeah. I don't know. I think that there's ways in which you have to work against your instincts for discipline, but also none of us became writers because we love discipline. So sometimes you just have to wander through the tunnel till you see the light at the end, right? All anyone else can give you is a flashlight.
Well, that might be a good segue to ways in which we can enliven our writing that aren't as linear or direct. Because early on in the podcast, many years ago, I interviewed Kyle Miner, and he said, sort of as an aside, that the main thing that was transformative for him as a writer was taking poetry seminars. He didn't explain why, and it wasn't the focus of what we were talking about. But over the years, for some reason, many listeners reached out and said that they had followed his advice and that they also found it transformative for them, even though they weren't. Maybe they saw it as permission to try something that wasn't comfortable for them at the time. And I know, Danielle, you used to have a practice of choosing one poem that you'd read every day for a month. And it made me wonder if re-encountering the same poem every day was if that was a practice, even though maybe it wasn't even meant as a practice. But I guess I wanted to open up. I wanted to hear from Danielle, but I also wanted to hear if there are things outside of prose that you go to that in an oblique way might help you refresh and come back to the work in the way Danielle describes it, in a more holistic way that's less analytical and less breaking things down.
Alcohol.
Yeah. Which type?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I like, and I should say I stole that practice from Elliot Holt, who I believe stole it from somebody else, and I can't remember. Maybe they're in the room, so hi. Thank you for that, if that was your project. But yeah, I did that for years, and then it felt too disciplined for me to choose a poem every month and read it every day, so I abandoned it. But I think the thing that I like about going to poetry is partly, and I promise I am getting to your question, but I'm going to back up a little bit because I don't work in straight lines. I think the thing that's interesting to me about the middle of the process, the revision process, is it's the point where the project most clearly belongs to you. At the beginning of a project, it belongs to itself, and you have to sit there and wait for it to tell you what it is and what it's doing and be patient with it. And toward the end of a project, even if you're still revising, there's an editor, and there's an agent, and there's a copy editor, and you can't panic and delete the whole chapter. I mean... We'll find out if we can. But so there's a point, I think, where it most purely is yours, even if you're filtering feedback, even if you're making decisions, right, in the middle of that project. But I also think it's sometimes maddening when you feel most in control of a thing you're working on to read other things that are like it. In poetry, I don't know, I think we kind of lie to people when we say that, workshops make you a better reader. No one goes to a puppet show to see the strings, I think what we teach you is how to see the strings. And it's great for your writing. It's not always good for joy and pleasure and not reading everything in a hypercritical mode. And poetry takes me back to my purest experience as a reader, of reading for sensory pleasure, of reading for joy, of reading for not trying to figure out why I even bother to write when someone is so much better than I am, or why I even bother to write when someone so mediocre is getting so much praise, right? I disengage from that process because I'm not in competition with it, because it's not a thing I do or can do or want to do. I'm just experiencing it as a reader and as a person who appreciates the form. And that in some way reminds me more of what I'm trying to do. I also think that thinking about language in ways that are not attached to the things that are within your control is just useful. Seeing the same words over and over again and thinking about what they do in kind of conjunction with each other in a way that doesn't feel like homework or a project makes you think about language in general.
Yeah, I think poetry is definitely something that is a part of my practice. Before I start, if I have a writing day, if I have time to write on a particular day, I like to start by reading poetry. And for some of the reasons that Danielle mentioned, I think I'm not at all an expert in poetry. I can't analyze it in any kind of intelligent way. But I love it, and I love sort of that unfiltered attention to language and to sound. And to a large degree, it really is sound, which is also why music is important for me. I can't listen to music while I'm writing, but having access to music and to rhythm just sort of makes me sort of feel like I'm in my body. So that when I go to the laptop, I get, I feel rhythmic. I feel like, with all the things I have to worry about, character and scene and blah, 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 blah. On a base level, it's just, do I have access to sounds, to syllables, to rhythms? And I find that really useful.
Yeah, that's really both of what you're saying is resonating with me. I feel as though in a lot of ways, as I'm revising, I'm working toward more and more joy and more delight. What I wanted with my first novel was to get to a point where I could open the book at random and read any line, and it would give me joy, and it would feel, and I wouldn't want to change it because it would be exactly what I wanted it to be. And for me to get there, I also love reading right before. I love reading at the start of a writing day. I love rereading old favorites. There's one book by Virginia Woolf that for about 3 years I would read just a little bit of it at the start of each writing day. And I know you're wondering which book it is, and I'm not going to tell you because I'm worried that if I tell people what it was, that she'll stop helping me. And I know that doesn't actually make sense, but whatever, man. Like, whatever works. And I'm 3 years into my new novel, and I still haven't found sort of like that keystone in a way, and that's a real problem for me, and I'm trying to find it. And there's something about just revisiting what I love, and the books I really love, the passages I really love. I love them on the 400th read, and they yield more and more riches the more I read them, and so rereading has been vital. And music too. I do listen to music while I write. I usually play one or at most two songs over and over again. There's one song that I've played I think 15,000 times, and it still helps me with my new novel. It almost feels to me like the sound of how I think at this point. Just anything to get me more into a state where it's a more meditative state where the anxiety falls away and I can forget where I am and who I am, because my best writing happens, or not even the best, the only real writing happens for me when I'm not there anymore and I've forgotten I have an I've forgotten I exist, and I'm more just like a medium for the words to come through me.
For me, it's just So for me, the whole thing is a little bit a combination of it's a little bit like meeting your person you're going to spend your life with. It's a combination of luck and perception and smarts. So if it's timing and luck, I got to put my ass in the chair at some point every day. So to get in that state that everyone's talking about, or to have any of these things happen, you have to make space, literally, in your job life, or I have 3 kids, or whatever, and then maybe this is where it breaks down drafting and revising for me. So the luck and the timing of having something that sparks you or interests you enough to read about it or write about it or put the shitty first draft down or whatever, and then the smarts to recognize what you've got on the page, as Jamel started us out with an hour ago. The sort of interrogation of what you did and what you gave yourself. So I don't. I think whatever works, right? But whether it's music or poetry or rereading the things you love or discovering new words. I mean, one of the great things about a week like this is I hear and people's work who I haven't encountered before. Whether it's teaching, workshop or whatever, but. At base, I have to make time to let that happen, and some people have lives that's easier for, and I'm privileged not to be making a living at my writing. I pay my bills another way, and so there's a kind of release of the stakes of that pressure. Like, I've got to write a short story to sell, or I've got to write a novel. I don't have to do that. And so my life allows for me to be able to sit down. And I, of course, I sabotage myself all the time about sitting down in the chair. But for me, it's just, you have to sit down and let all those tricks go to work.
Seems like a good place to end. Thanks.